It's coming to you from the beautiful metaverse. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And I'm endeavoring to make sure that we have actually gone live, and I am not certain. So give me just a moment. Oh, and there we are. Uh, I've been a little nervous the last couple of days since I missed one by being missed a step and didn't actually go live. So I'm trying to make sure that I do now. Welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. If you have any comments or questions, they should show up in chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk for half an hour. Um, some days we're going to be very focused on this program, some days less. Um, and today I had a few things I thought I'd talk about. On Friday, I talked about leadership. Today, I thought I would talk a little bit more about psychic matters, but I also wanted to talk about some issues that are relevant to both in terms of and to life in general. And I was thinking before I came on camera that I was particularly pleased with today's outfit. I'm wearing Lady Crystal's pearl, and it resonates with all the grays beautifully. And I'm as an artist, I view my clothing as a work of art. Some years ago, I was interviewed by the delightful Title Tarot, or actually, I beg your pardon, Tarot Title. And Title asked about why I dress the way that I dress. And my answer was, and it's been a few years, so I'm not exactly quoting, but it's really about, I think what I said was that I try to dress as though every person I was going to see is important because they are. Every place I'm going is important because it is. Um, and to me, that's an aspect of respect. It's an aspect of mutual respect, um, for me to, one, respect myself, and two, respect the person that I'm seeing by showing that I care enough to dress for the occasion. And welcome to Lilith in the chat room. Good to see you. And in that program also, when asked how I'd like to be remembered, I think I said that I would like to be remembered as someone who made the world a better place and was well dressed while doing it. But the point that I'm trying to come around to is respect. Um, I said that I was going to focus on psychic issues today, and respect actually is one. Particularly if you're going to be a professional psychic reader, you have to respect your clients, particularly if you expect them to respect you. You also have to demand reasonable respect from them, because there are people who are very dismissive of psychics. In my opinion, you should not put up with that. If someone is insulting to you, you should not deal with them. And I have been known to turn people away for that reason, because I felt they had insulted me, and I don't need that. Um, but I would only do that if it were something serious. Um, but I think that in life, it's very important how we treat one another. I'm a great believer in the idea of what some people would call right relationship. I'm a great believer in the teachings of Confucius, which are all about this concept. Now, of course, Confucius lived in ancient China, and some of the social conventions that Confucius endorses are not conventions that we would endorse here, but the concept of mutual respect as the underlying basis of civilized society still applies. I think one of the problems we're experiencing in society today is a lack of basic respect for one another. Um, and I think that restoring that concept of treating people with respect would go a long way toward helping to avoid the kind of unpleasant situations we're seeing unfold in the world. Of course, we can't just wave our hand and make that happen, but we can make it happen in our own lives by treating the people we know as well as we can. Um, and I think that usually that's not hard. I think for most people, your mother taught you before you went to kindergarten. That's my explanation for the Wiccan Rede as well. What the Wiccan Rede really means is what most people's mothers taught them before sending them to kindergarten. Don't smack the next kid on the head for no reason. Don't steal their toys. Treat them decently and with respect. Um, and that is the larger part, I think, of the interpretation in terms of how you should behave. if you treat people respectfully, you're unlikely to do them harm. Although I do feel it's very important we remember that word harm, which does not mean hurting someone's feelings. It means doing them actual damage. And Lilith has a question. Can I ask you if you know if the upcoming illustration will be accessible for Europeans? Um, I am not 100% certain. I assume you mean by time. I think it's scheduled for noon Eastern. Let me let me just check and see if I can give you a definite answer for that. Um, but I suspect it probably is. I would say that if you inquire on the Corellian membership hub, you should get a direct answer to that. Since my retirement, I actually do not have the schedule in front of me. I believe it's 2 o'clock on Sunday. I certainly will presently know. Um, did I say 12 o'clock on Sunday? That's what I meant. Noon on Sunday. Which I think is probably not the best time for Europeans, but perhaps not the worst either. It would be an hour before this. So if you can make this, you should be able to make that, I would think. But I would double check, and in fact, I can double check after the program and get back to you tomorrow also. I just don't have it in front of me. But that's probably something I should talk about this week also, the character of the illustration, what it's about. We have talked about that in the past, but it probably would be good to talk a little more about it. How illustrations came to be the public ceremony they are today. Uh, Hello, Brian, and happy Monday to you. Uh, and But today I was going to talk about psychic matters, and yeah, I was talking about the importance of respect. Um, and I think that makes everything in life simpler. But it certainly makes psychic work simpler if you approach it in that way. Um, I've talked before about the importance of grounding in psychic work, and I could not be more fortunate to have come from the Corellian background and to have learned how to do psychic work before I actually got into the psychic business. And interestingly, I was thinking before this program, as I was preparing to get my degree from the small college that I went to, I had a meeting with a guidance counselor in which they were recommending different careers. And it was pretty obvious that this was all by rote. They had a list. And one of the ones they recommended was being a psychic reader. And I was absolutely floored that they would recommend that. But oddly enough, it's exactly what I did. Um, and Lilith, or I beg your pardon, Brian asks, if on the topic of psychic work and respect, could I talk about how to be comfortable explaining your boundaries and enforcing them? I think it depends in part on what exactly you mean, but I'm assuming areas you might not be willing to read for example. And I have had that happen. Um, I have had people who wanted to ask me questions that simply were not appropriate. And I told them no. And I think the answer to this is that you would be comfortable explaining your boundaries and enforcing them within the context of psychic work, the same as you would have to be in other parts of life. It might be an unpleasant moment, depending what it was, but it must be done. And I had one woman who had come to me years ago, and she was trying to find damaging information about other people. And even worse, they had clearly done her no harm. She was just a very negative individual. And I had to tell her, no, I can't give you this information. Wasn't that I couldn't see it necessarily, it just was not appropriate for her to have it. And I simply said, no, this is not appropriate. And in doing that, you should be patient. You should explain why it's not appropriate, and you should expect that they're not going to listen to you. And you're probably going to have to refund their money and send them away, because if they're asking you to go beyond your boundaries, they're probably not going to be reasonable. Though this does depend on what your boundaries, what boundaries we're talking about. But if it's things that you don't feel are appropriate to discuss, chances are they're going to try to press you to discuss it anyway. Um, that at least has been my experience. Now, some people, of course, will listen when you explain why it's not appropriate, and then you have a wonderful situation. But chances are, if someone's asking something inappropriate in the first place, they're going to continue to be inappropriate. That at least is based on my own experiences. And what's inappropriate? Um, that is, to some extent, each person kind of has to answer that for themselves. My answer is partly spirit will tell you if it's inappropriate. Um, and another example where you might have to explain your boundaries and enforce them is people who want free readings from you because they're friends, and you just have to say no. Of course, that depends where you're at as a reader and what you want to do. But as a professional reader, doctors don't give free exams. Um, Psychologists don't normally give free counseling sessions. Um, Artists don't give free artwork as a rule. What you do as a profession, you charge for. You can make exceptions, but you should do it judiciously. Um, because chances are, if you do one, they'll want another, and then another, and then another. And it depends on how you feel. If your feeling toward that person is such that that's all right with you, and if the readings you're doing are not sufficiently taxing to make it a problem, that's perfectly fine. Um, and it it really depends on your circumstance. There are certain people I have traded readings with over the years. Very, very few. Lady Crystal and I would read for each other all the time. Um, but very few people would I do that with, and very few people would I be willing to get a reading from under most circumstances. I usually try to stay in good contact with spirit, and um, and I make my own destiny, and therefore don't really like getting readings for that reason. Because once I've heard it said, I feel like my ability to change it is prejudiced. Whereas when I speak to spirit, that is not the case. But there are times when I would be willing to get a reading. It depends who it is. It depends the kind of reading. If it's an unusual kind of reading, I mentioned the doll lady once, who read by selection of dolls of like 50 dolls she had on her table. Uh, if she were still living, I would love a reading from her, just because it would be so unusual. If I had a chance to get a reading from Terry Milton again, the Stone Lady in New England, I would love to have a reading from her. Um, but this is not that these were particular types of readings that were fascinating in themselves. What Terry had was a whole tray full of stones, and you would choose the stones, um, and she would read you by the stones you chose. And it was fascinating in that sense just by itself. And I've seen a lot of interesting reading styles, and they do, to me, make a difference of what I would want to do with a reading. But mostly, I don't pursue readings as a rule, though I do sometimes make exceptions. But talking about what's appropriate with a reading, if someone's trying to use their reading to hurt someone else, I think that's inappropriate. Um, it might depend on what we mean by hurt someone else. It also depends on what the situation is. But generally speaking, I would not consider that appropriate. I mentioned the lady who was always trying to get damaging information on other people. I did read for her more than once because I thought, having explained this, maybe she would avoid it when she came back. But I eventually had to tell her, no, I can never read for you. It was just not appropriate. Um, on the other hand, it's not uncommon for people to ask questions about their romantic partner that I don't think are inappropriate, um, because they're part of that relationship. Or business partners, and the same thing. Um, I definitely remember a reading I did many years ago in which part of the information I got was that this person was about to sign a contract with a business person that they absolutely should not sign. It was going to be a disaster for them, and they needed to avoid it. That's not an inappropriate question nor an inappropriate answer. That's what they needed to know. And by the way, they did sign it, and I believe it was just as big a disaster as it was predicted, though it was great for the other person, um, who basically ended up taking over their business. Um, the best example that I can give of what's inappropriate as a psychic reader. Um, I had a friend named Christy Passion who had been a Corellian priestess many, many years ago, and then, like many people, gone her own way. And she was a professional psychic, a highly regarded professional psychic, and she was reading for a high level of clientele. And one of her clients was the wife of, I believe, an NFL football player. And this woman was asking how to kill her husband. And she was trying to get Christy to advise her on this situation. And the first time, Christy thought, well, this woman's upset and frustrated. And she humored her and basically said, no, you shouldn't do this. Spirit says you shouldn't do this. When the woman came back and asked again, Christy became alarmed and contacted the authorities. And it ended up the woman was deadly serious. She meant to murder her husband and wanted Christy to guide her psychically in this pursuit. And of course, Christy was not willing to do this. This is not appropriate. And I tell this story partly because it became national news. If you were watching the news at that time, you would have seen them on the news. It became a huge issue. Um, and of course, Christy did exactly the right thing because her client had told her they were planning a crime, a big crime, murder. And she went to the authorities, which is what you should do in that situation. So it was more than just boundaries. It was like legal boundaries. And it worked out. I would say the best for everyone. The woman did not murder her husband. I think she ended up in huge legal trouble, but I think that's better than murdering your husband. So I'd say even for her, it worked out well in that sense. And Lilith says, what I also see often is people asking questions in readings that most readers I come across always give in general, fluffy answers which can be applied to millions of people, and I find that inappropriate. I know what you mean, and I think it depends what I would say to that on the situation, because sometimes it also depends what there's there to be seen. Um, some people you're going to get a lot of information on, some you'll get less. Um, what I try to do is to answer the questions before the person has a chance to ask them. Usually when I do a reading, what I say is, let's first see what spirit says for you, and then you can ask questions. And I often find that by the time we get to questions, they have none. Spirit has answered them. And I think that's a good way to do it. I think that the less you know about the person you're reading for, the better off you are, the better reading they're going to get, um, and the less general it's likely to be. But some people, they don't have anything going on that isn't general. Um, but I think that using that as your default behavior would be inappropriate, yes. Um, what I find is that people's situations tend to be very individual, and you will get those answers if you go for them. I've often talked about how when we were doing readings in Salem, we decided to offer 5-minute mini readings for free, with the hope that people would then buy a longer reading. And we had all kinds of people saying, that's not possible. You can't get anything decent in 5 minutes. Well, in point of fact, yes, you can. And it kind of backfired on us because a lot of people didn't need the longer reading after they got that 5-minute reading. Because if you know how to get in, you can get everything in a 5-minute reading, or at least enough that people will have the answers they came for. And Lavola in the chat room, and what a lovely name, Asked if I have a favorite deck that I use for my readings, and yes, I do. I actually have several answers to that right now. I use my own deck, the Tarot of Hecate, which is temporarily out of print, but we do hope to have it back in print later this year. You'll be able to find that at CorellianPublishing.com. It is unusual in being a 100-card tarot deck, and is my own design, my own artwork. It also is part of the Infinite Tarot, which is much expanded. But in addition to that, I've had other favorites over the years that I still favor highly. I've always loved my very first tarot deck, the Tarot of the Hoi Polloi. I do not have it handy to show to you, although it's right over on the bookcase. But the Tarot of the Hoi Polloi is a Rider-Waite-Smith knockoff, in which the artwork has been reproduced in a style reminiscent of stained glass, using, I believe, watercolor paint and a heavy black line. Very artistic, even now, I favor that if I want to use any kind of Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And it was ubiquitous in the 1970s, and has a key on the back. So you may have seen one. Other than that, I love the Morgan Greer deck. For many years, it was my favorite. And it too is right over there on the shelf. The Morgan Greer deck, if you have never seen it, again, is very artistic. It's very richly colored. And, I'm someone who, although I'm dressed in monotone gray today, I love color. And many people historically have felt I use too much of it in my artwork. When I was in college, I was told that I shoot my head off with color. I would attribute that to my cultural background, but also my personal taste. I like color. And the Morgan Greer is a very colorful deck, and yet all the colors are in balance, which to me is the art of it. To use lots of colors, but to keep them balanced, I think is a good thing. Also, the back of Morgan Greer is a blue sky with white stars, which is a motif that strongly appeals to me. You'll see it a lot in my own artwork. And hello to Matthew in the chat room. And that certainly was not the reason that was one of my favorite decks, but it was a reason. What other decks have I used over the years and been very fond of? Those were my favorites, but I've also used, for example, the new Palladini, which is a very Art Deco deck. I believe it was Sir Edward's favorite, or one of them, or was that the Aquarian Tarot? I think they're both by the same person. I'm not certain off the top of my head. I also was very fond of the Arthurian Tarot until I found out that it was produced in such a way that having used it for 6 months, it was starting to fall apart. At that point, I had to put it aside, but the artwork was still one of my favorites. And the Tarot of the Ages, which I used to jokingly call the Tarot of the Naked People, because there was not a lot of costuming in this tarot. But I liked it because, like the Tarot of Hecate, it was very multicultural and very interesting in that sense, and beautifully executed artistically. So those are the ones that I have enjoyed over the years. At one time, I had a huge collection of tarot cards, not so much anymore. I find that the huge collections I once put together have been leaving me one by one, but this is life. It's one of the things that happens. And pardon my alarm. And it's interesting. This is the second time today an alarm has gone off in this house. The first one was due to a dead battery. But perhaps I need to be paying attention to that. I mean, these are things that could be omens. However, in this case, it's a perfectly ordinary thing. In fact, they're really both perfectly ordinary things that happen, but that's also part of omens. An omen is not necessarily extraordinary in itself, but in its timing. One of the most impressive omens I had was last year, an owl sitting on a fence watching me for a protracted period of time. And I took a photo of this owl. I put it on my Facebook page and my Instagram and various other places. It was the most remarkable thing. It's never happened before in my life. I definitely took it as an omen, and I spoke to spirit, and I was told that this was an omen about a particular person. An owl is an omen of death in many cases. And I did protective work for that person, and lo and behold, found out that the next day they had nearly had a fatal car accident, or what they thought would have been a fatal car accident. They avoided it altogether, but only barely. And I've always thought that was the omen, and that it was there to tell me to take that protective step. Also, later that year, there was a peacock in our backyard. Um, and hello to Eddie in the chat room, who remarks that owls are not known as a good messenger. Um, there are different cultural backgrounds, but as I say, for me, I've always understood the owl as an omen of death, or sometimes serious situations like the one I've just described that can be avoided, but you're being warned of. It's like the black cat. People sometimes think having a black cat cross in front of you is an omen of misfortune. What it is, it's a warning, and it says that you need to do some sort of evasive action. Um, as I was saying, we had a peacock show up in the backyard. There are no peacocks in this neighborhood. It was bizarre, and incredibly beautiful. But omens can be like that. They can be very remarkable, and yet at the same time, it was obviously just somebody's escaped peacock. Um, and so omens are at one and the same time both remarkable and mundane, depending on how you approach them. If you're a person who listens to omens, you should always pay attention. And Lilith remarks that for her, the owl stands for wisdom, and that's true for many people. To me, the owl is associated with deities such as Hecate, and obviously also Athena, who are protective in character. So I take it as a warning of something that must be protected from, or that message of death. And I've told the story of Lady Bitterwind's crossing, which was foretold to us by an owl about 20 minutes before we got the news. We were doing a ceremony at the tombs of the ancestors in Danville. And as we entered the cemetery and began to walk among the tombs, an owl flew through the cemetery. And at first we dismissed it because one of the archpriesthood felt that it was a personal symbol for him. But as we began the ceremony, Lady Crystal got a cell phone call that turned out to inform us of Lady Bitterwind's passing. And Lady Bitterwind, for those not familiar with her, was the longest serving first elder of the Corellian tradition. She was also a most interesting artist, and I have a number of pieces of her artwork that I may be offering for sale soon. And Eddie remarks that the peacock is commonly understood as Hera's messenger. And also within a particularly Corellian context, the peacock represents the first priesthood in terms of their external sense. In the investiture ceremony of the first priesthood, it follows the steps of the alchemical marriage, part of which is the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail. And this represents the worldly aspect of that office, which, considering everything that's happened since, is very interesting. And hello to Charlene in the chat room. Charlene remarks that a turkey crossed the road yesterday as they were driving. And what a turkey would represent could very much depend on your background. Obviously, it can represent prosperity, it can represent sustenance, and it can also represent authority. Turkey feathers were used to make robes of state in southeastern Native American culture. And so I would add that as one way to understand the turkey. But your particular background may have other ways. So these are some of the ways that you approach omens. And we started talking about psychic work in general. We've ended up talking more specifically about omens, but you know, divination in the end is an organized system of omens. You tell spirit, this is the language I will understand. Spirit uses it to speak to you. Omens are the same. You tell spirit, I understand these things to mean these things. The spirit will send them as a way of speaking to you. Um, and I find that whatever system different people or different cultures understand, it will work for them because it's really that connection to spirit that is sending the message. And that's the idea behind the famous saying, as above, so below. What is universal is also individual. And and hello to Vivian in the chat room who says, I really enjoy these segments and that they have no politics. And I suppose that's true. Um, because we are talking spirituality, and I can't guarantee that I would never make any statements that touch on politics, but that's not why we're here. So chances are you're politics safe. Um, and you know, I hope that you've enjoyed the program. We have come to the end of our half hour, and I'm going to close with a prayer as I always do. And please come back tomorrow. And oh, and hello to His Eminence, the First Priest, the Most Reverend Phoenix. Welcome. Um, Phoenix, there was a question about the time of lustration. Do you have that off the top of your head before I sign out? Um, Vivian says that her son and she found a red hawk feather in perfect condition in Colorado yesterday and kept it. And yes, I would say that's a very positive omen. Phoenix does not off the top of his head. So I will have that for you tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm expecting to talk about the 5 Mystic Secrets of the Great Pagan Masters, which was a book my mother wrote 40 years ago. The first major written exposition of Corellian ideas, not the only thing she ever wrote. And the book, the binders I was sharing with you last week contain some of her other writings, which we might look into reprinting. But the 5 Mystic Secrets is what she's known for and is considered a cornerstone of Corellian thought. Um, and I was planning to talk about that tomorrow. So I hope you enjoyed the program, and now we will have our closing prayer. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, help us to be heedful of your messages and your guidance. Help us to listen to that inner voice which directs us. Help us to see the omens in our life. Help us to know that you are with us always. And when you give us messages, we know that it's easy to miss or to ignore, but help us to be mindful and to understand those messages we receive. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we ask you this. May you be blessed now and always. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always also.